Hello and welcome to another of the Rock Reflections at this special time of Christmas. When a writer or a reporter gives an account of something that has happened in the past, they're able to do that in two different ways. One way is to describe in detail the factual events as they happened. When did it take place? What happened, who was involved, and so on. Another way is to look at the significance of what happened and ask yourself, what's going on here in these events? Now, in the gospel writers in the Bible, Matthew and Luke seem to adopt the first of those ways. They describe what happened at that first Christmas time. Where did it take place? In the little town of Bethlehem, not far from Jerusalem. When did it take place? Well, during a census ordered by the Roman authorities. Who are the characters involved? Well, there was Joseph and Mary. And exactly what happened? Well, Mary gave birth to a baby boy whose name was Jesus, and she laid the baby in a manger. This is how Matthew and Luke describe what happened on that first Christmas. The fourth gospel writer, John, seems to adopt the second of the two ways. It's as if John says, wait a minute, what's going on here? And his answer is as brief as it is mind-blowing. Here is what he says, John chapter 1 and verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Or some translations put it, the Word became human and made his dwelling among us. This is how John sees the significance of what was taking place. He calls Jesus the Word. The Word is a strange term to describe somebody. A word, after all, is a means of communication. And right back at the beginning of this chapter of John chapter 1, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In other words, from the very beginning, God is a God who communicates. Some of us will remember a very influential book that was published many years ago. Actually, before that book came on the scene, there was a previous one written by the same author, Francis Schaeffer, a Christian philosopher and apologist. It was called The God Who Is There. And in that book, Schaeffer presented the arguments for the existence of God, that there really is a God who objectively exists. And then he wrote the second book, and this is the one I was really wanting to refer to. He is there, and he is not silent. And in this book, Francis Schaeffer was wanting to argue the fact that this God who objectively exists, the creator of heaven and earth, is not a God who is just abstract and impersonal, but he is a God who communicates, who speaks. And John says that this is a characteristic of God from the very beginning. God has always been a God who speaks and communicates. Remember Genesis chapter 1? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, see, there is the word, God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, let there be a separation between the waters above and the waters on earth. And then God said, this should happen, and God declared that that should happen, and creation took place. And all the way through the Old Testament, we see that God is a God who speaks and who communicates. God said to Noah to build an ark because a flood was soon to envelop the earth. God said to Abraham, leave your own country and your neighbors and go to a country that I will show you, and I'll make of you a great nation, and all the nations of the world will be blessed through you. God appeared to Moses in Egypt in a burning bush. And from that burning bush, God said, I have seen the plight of my people, and I've come down to rescue them. And God told Moses to prepare to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. Later on, God said to Joshua, the successor to Moses, "Be strong and very courageous. Do not be afraid, for you will lead this people into the promised land." God said to the child Samuel in the temple in the middle of the night, in fact, he called him by name, "Samuel, Samuel." And then God told the child Samuel what he was to say when he entered the prophetic ministry. And speaking of prophets, of course, throughout the prophetic books of the Bible, this phrase keeps on coming back. "Thus saith the Lord," is how the old versions have it. In the newer translations, "This is what the Lord says. This is what the Lord says. This is what the Lord says." Well over 1,000 times in the Old Testament, that phrase, "God said," or "This is what the Lord says," comes again and again. So God is a God who speaks, who communicates to the people he has made by the nature that he has created around them, by the things that he does for them, by the words that he communicates through his prophets. But, and this is the point, God wanted to speak so clearly, so unambiguously, so unmistakably, that he came in person. And this is what John is saying. The Word became flesh, became human, and dwelt among us. And as you read the gospel stories, you'll see that Jesus, when he became a man and started his public ministry, the words that he spoke had a ring of authority about them. People said, "We've never heard somebody speaking like this before." And they were amazed at the graciousness and the authority, the directness that came from his mouth. It was as if they were hearing the very voice of God. And when they saw Jesus reaching out and touching a diseased person with leprosy and healing him, they saw before their very eyes God's compassion and his power. And when they saw Jesus opening the eyes of the blind, they saw God's power to bring light into darkness. And when they saw Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, they saw the power of God at work through Jesus, bringing life even from death. And so all the way through the life of Jesus, we see that this word, this eternal word of communicating, was active in the life of Jesus. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. God spoke through words. Jesus spoke through words. He spoke through deeds. He spoke especially through the very presence of his person. By way of illustration, just this last week, I met a lady who lives in the next road from ours. We often come across her as she walks her dog in the park. And she was looking rather down, I thought. And so I asked her, how are you and how are you managing this time of shutdown? And she hesitated, and then she said, with tears in her eyes, she said, "Just yesterday, my brother, who doesn't live very far away, the carer went to his house as usual to help him with his needs, and she found him dead on the floor of his house." She could hardly speak. She said, I was very close to my brother. I feel his going so deeply. I tried to sympathize with her and express my concern. When I got back home, I told Christine, and we decided we had to do something about it. And so we bought some flowers, a beautiful bouquet of flowers as a gesture of sympathy and comfort. We wrote a card making clear that we felt her pain and that we were praying for her and hoping that she would find the comfort of God in this time. But perhaps most important, we decided we would take the flowers and the card with us in person to her house, because yes, the flowers would communicate something and the words on the card would communicate something, but more than everything else, our presence there at her house, at her front door, of course we couldn't go in, but at her front door, would communicate the concern and the sympathy and the love that we felt for her. And this is what happened when the Word became flesh. We express ourselves in deeds, in words, but especially in our presence and our personal relationships. And this is what God did when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This Christmas again, here in Yate and in Chipping Sodbury and in thousands of homes around the country and across the world, the usual Christmas celebrations will take place. Admittedly, there are certain restrictions, but there will be the festivities, there will be the decorations, there will be the Christmas trees. There are the amazing lights. We've seen so many lights on people's homes and in people's gardens this year. There'll be the wonderful food, and all this is very right and good. But the central message of Christmas is that the Word became flesh, became a human being, and dwelt among us. And as we look at him, we're able to see the very presence of God. I'm sure many of you will know those wonderful words in the poem by John Betjeman entitled Christmas. In it, he describes in very beautiful poetic language all the festivities of Christmas that we're so well aware of in people's homes, in churches, in the high street, in shops, and so on and so on. And then at the end of towards the end of the poem, he pauses, and this is how the poem ends. And is it true? And is it true? This most tremendous tale of all, seen in a stained glass window hue, a baby in an ox's stall, the maker of the stars and sea, become a child on earth for me? And is it true? For if it is, no loving fingers tying strings around those tissued fripperies, the sweet and silly Christmas things, bath salts and inexpensive scents and hideous ties so kindly meant. No love that in a family dwells, no caroling in frosty air, nor all the steeple-shaking bells can with this single truth compare, that God was man in Palestine and lives today in your heart and mine. Well, my prayer for you this Christmas is that in amongst all the other wonderful things that we remember and do at Christmas, this great central truth will be very prominent in your mind and in your heart. The Word became flesh, became human, and dwelt among us. May that truth bring great cheer and happiness this Christmas to you and to us all.